Hello. Before we begin, I'd like to recap what we covered last week in part. If you recall, we covered the first 15 verses of Psalm 50, and I explained how these psalms were, or are, in fact, songs that are meant to be sung, which you'll want to keep in mind as we proceed, because certain lines that we'll read in a moment will seem harsh, if not intolerably violent, when taken literally. But when taken as poetry, and they are poetry, as painting emotions with words, then we can arrive at the heart of the message of this song. As we discussed last week, the first half of the 50th Psalm was all about the manner of sacrifice we are meant to bring to a God who, in fact, already has everything. The psalmist made the claim that God was not satisfied with the offerings of the people, not because they weren't in an abundant amount, or that they weren't good enough, but rather that God was not hungry. God already had everything that God needed and not anything more. So the people are thinking at this point, why bring anything at all? And then the punchline, the point that the psalmist made, is that we give not because God needs what we bring, but because in giving back some of the good things we've received, we enter into a greater relationship of trust and reliance on God. What's more, when we yield back some of what we possess back to our community, we begin to participate in the ways of God, giving to others just as God has given us life, creation, love, water, light, and many other things besides. And in paying these gifts forward, we begin to experience the joy of God in the giving. And our hearts beat a little more like God's in the giving by way of our generosity. That was last week. And we concluded with verse 15, which reads, "Call on me in the day of trouble. I will deliver you, and you shall glorify me." And there it is, simply stated, a trusting relationship between the God of the universe and the people. It's established. But the psalm moves on, and the singer begins to give what I will here call a lament, or a word of warning. A lament for those who do not enter into life of the community by way of generosity and selflessness. Keep this in mind as we proceed, and keep what I said before in mind as well, that these are poetic expressions meant to convey the cost. What it costs us when we fail to turn our focus outward in service of others. There is a price to pay. So without further reflection, here it goes. The psalmist continues in Psalm 50, starting with verse 16. But to the wicked, God says, "What right have you to recite my statutes or take my covenant on your lips? For you hate discipline, and you cast my words behind you. You make friends with a thief when you see one, and you keep company with adulterers. You give your mouth free rein for evil, and your tongue frames deceit. You sit and speak against your kin. You slander your own mother's child. These things you have done, and I have been silent. You thought that I was one just like yourself. But now I rebuke you and lay the charge before you. Mark this, then, you who forget God, or I will tear you apart, and there will be no one to deliver. Those who bring thanksgiving as their sacrifice honor me. To those who go the right way, I will show the salvation of God." Verse 15 may have ended on a high and hopeful note, one that described a deepening, life-giving relationship with the Creator of all. But now the song folds and turns in a different direction. The psalmist, still singing to the same congregation, describes a community that goes another way. that turns from the life-giving practices of generosity and sacrifice to others and instead becomes inward-focused, self-seeking, and even predatory. What's more, the psalmist describes a community that pays a heavy price, that it costs them when its people turn away from the ways of God. And it does cost us. Verse 16 opens with words that describe a community where the people show up to worship, but do not live as if the words they recite in church have any sway on their lives. But to the wicked, God says, "What right have you to recite my statutes, or take my covenant on your lips? For you hate discipline, and you cast my words behind you." Here is described rank hypocrisy. Here are people who mouth words of charity, grace, and posture as if they care about justice, yet their very lives are lived in opposition to the message they profess. They hate discipline, a word that perhaps more accurately should be translated as instruction, is what the word means. In other words, they spurn God's guidance and then cast these life-giving words behind them in preference for a more narcissistic path. Then, this community is described, and the picture ain't pretty. Here is a community filled with people who make friends with thieves, presumably to better their own situation. Here is a community filled with people who keep company with adulterous people, people who do not make good on their vows and promises to others, people who betray and disregard those they have vowed to remain faithful to. Then the psalmist describes a people who use their words to destroy others, even those closest to them. I don't know if you picked up on a turn of phrase that was in the 20th verse, but here it goes, starting with the 19th verse. You give your mouth free rein for evil, and your tongue frames deceit. You sit and speak against your kin, your relatives, and then you slander your own mother's child. I mean, that's your sibling, but the relationship has become so strained because of the damage you've done with your words that you no longer name them brother or sister. So even siblings are not immune from the verbal onslaught, and I've seen it before, families rent apart by harsh words. After this scathing analysis of a community in disarray, the word from the Lord concludes, "These things you have done, and I have been silent. You thought that I was one just like yourself, but now I rebuke you and lay the charge before you." Well, at this point, this all seems so abstract. After all, the song was written so long ago to a community that lived thousands of years ago. So perhaps I should bring the gist of the message into our modern context, because things are not so different today. We live in a culture that in many ways fits the description of the back half of this psalm. Unjust economic systems burden the poor and line the pockets of those who hold power. Partnerships are made with thieves for profit. People who have shown themselves to be untrustworthy again and again continue to maintain power and influence, and words are still used to damage and destroy friend and enemy alike. You know, there's even a whole genre of television dedicated to this way. It's called reality TV. Reality TV shows will often take a group of the most self-absorbed, flamethrower-mouthed, unfaithful, cheat-to-get-ahead types, and then place them in scenarios that pit them against one another for our entertainment. One has to wonder about a society that holds this obsession or is captivated by this kind of thing. Sometimes the people in these shows are very influential, celebrities even, people we respect outside of the show and hold roles in our society that many wish to emulate. Here is perhaps a parody of our culture writ large. But the thing about parody is it echoes reality, albeit in an exaggerated, grandiose way. What I'm trying to say is watching quote-unquote reality TV may be a bit like a culture looking into a mirror. And religious life in America has adapted to this highly commercialized, individualized, narcissistic society. The Christian message has been reframed, I might even say co-opted, for a self-absorbed, self-help, obsessed, narcissistic culture. And in so doing, our churches, far from being cultural hubs and nexuses of life-giving community, as they have been in the past at times, have instead become better at marketing, better at branding, and better at shaping a message that began with, "Then he said to them all, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me." The words of Jesus from Luke chapter 9:23. Well, somehow that message has shifted, and the gospel of me states, "Seek ye first the kingdom of me, and all these things will be added unto me." And churches are expected to cater to a wide, ever-changing array of individualized religious expressions and experiences. And if you don't like it, you can shop for another church that does it better. Of these trends, Reverend Wes Granberg Michelson writes, "Our contemporary congregations," and I'm quoting, "our contemporary congregations often don't live that way," the life-giving way he's talking about. Implicitly, members assume the church is really all about their individual fulfillment. We talk about what one got out of the sermon. Church staff work feverishly to figure out how to meet the needs and expectations of individuals with special interests. When looking for a congregation to join, we commonly refer to the practice of church shopping. It becomes another consumer activity with the sole goal of self-gratification. And as a minister of the gospel and a pastor, I can tell you that I have experienced this again and again and again. People looking for that hyper-individualized mode of religious expression that I am meant to bring into their lap. And if the psalmist can call out the religious in his time, here it is for mine. We claim to be disciples of Jesus, the Son of God, of whom it is quoted, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." But in practice, we have become exceedingly self-serving in our worship and church life. Therein lies our hypocrisy, our failure to live up to the gospel we keep and profess in church by way of word and song and prayer. In the meantime, we remain alone and lonely, siloed off and categorized by way of our hyper-individualized needs and wants. This is a very lonely culture. Communities barely exist anymore as we've become more and more self-absorbed and willing to make any number of personal compromises to get on in this complex, compromised economy. What I'm trying to say is, I agree with the psalmist. When we turn away from the practices of gratitude that are outward and other-focused, when we fail to give of ourselves for the life of our community, it costs us. And what does it cost us exactly? Well, it costs us the ability to live well in a community. It costs us life as it was meant to be lived. It costs us loving, nurturing communities that address the needs of humanity. The ways of a self-absorbed, lie, cheat, steal to get ahead culture leads to destruction. Or, as the psalmist put it in quite colorful language, "Mark this then, you who forget God, or I will tear you apart and there will be no one to deliver." Here, the poet notes how narcissistic, self-absorbed communities are torn apart, tear themselves apart. They fail to function and they fall to pieces. Such is the story of many churches, communities, countries, and empires alike. to abandon an outward focus, one that calls us to think first of others, to take note of our neighbors, to give of ourselves for the life of the world, just as Jesus gave his life for the life of the world. It costs us more than we can readily understand. It costs us the very vision of the church as cast in Acts chapter 2. The vision that has inspired the church and motivates us to reach higher. And I'm sure you've read it before, but here it is again. Imagine such a community. Starting with verse 42, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and prayers. All came upon everyone because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. What it costs us is this vision for a life-giving community that is the church described in the beginning. We are hungry for this life. I know I am. As we said last week, God is not hungry. We are hungry for this. We are hungry for the kind of community described in the book of Acts, a life-giving community that nourishes its members and gives us purpose. When a community becomes inward-focused, self-centered, and narcissistic, it all falls apart. But again, our people are hungry. The church is uniquely positioned to counter this culture that has been left malnourished by its narcissism and to offer another way. The psalmist, after describing a community that has abandoned the principles of gratitude, thanksgiving, and generosity, the ways of God, then offers the punchline. And here is the good news. This diatribe was for a purpose, as any good sermon should be. All this to say, and here goes, those who bring thanksgiving as their sacrifice honor me. To those who go the right way, I will show the salvation of God. This path, this way of generosity, in other words, leads to salvation, our salvation, life, love, and every good thing. The psalmist only broke the bad news to tell the congregation the good news, that there is a way forward that begins with thanksgiving, that then folds into generosity. And the good news for this pastor is that we are already well on our way. Our church, specifically Northwood Christian Church, has been a church filled with congregants who have been very generous for many years. We are a community filled with members who have given their time, life's energies, and their resources, and have used these things to bless others. We expect to continue in this tradition, no doubt about it. And right now, we find ourselves midway through this year's conversation about resources and money, knowing that our people will continue to be exceedingly gracious. As I said, we are well on our way. But I would like to take this opportunity to invite others along the way as well. If you have been disheartened, discouraged, or even deflated by our hyper-individualized consumer culture and its hyper-individualized consumer-grade Christianity, we welcome you on this journey. Hear the words of the psalmist and take the warning as you may, and then leave the destructive ways described there behind. Consider how you might give of your own time or energy or resources to support the life-giving work that continues to persist at Northwood. This month, we've chosen to focus primarily on how our money and what we do with it might better reflect God's values, but there are other gifts that you may give as well. Your time, your ideas, your talents, perhaps more important than your money. We all have something to give. Or, if not here at Northwood, where? Find the place that needs new life and discover how your gifts might cultivate new life in that place, where your gifts and resources might connect. God has called us together for this purpose, for life together. So let's share it. the closing words of the first letter to Timothy seem fitting here, and I'd like to conclude with them, starting with chapter 6, verse 17. As for those who are in the present age rich, command them not to be haughty or to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but rather on God who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, generous and ready to share, thus storing up for themselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of the life that really is life. There's the invitation to enter into this life that really is life.